You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. The elevator descended through floors that didn't exist on any blueprint, past foundations that predated the Vatican itself. Cardinal Alessandro's breathing grew more laboured with each level, as if the weight of centuries pressed down upon us both. When the ancient mechanism finally shuddered to a halt, we stood before a door marked only with symbols I recognized from my doctorate in medieval demonology, symbols that should have been lost to history. Father Thomas Benedetti, Alessandro's voice carried the weight of confession. What I'm about to show you will change how you see our holy church forever. The chamber beyond defied comprehension. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into darkness above, while shelves stretched endlessly in all directions, filled with books, scrolls, and artifacts that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent energy. The air itself felt thick, as if saturated with whispered prayers and screamed confessions spanning 2 millennia. The Vatican's true mission, Alessandro continued, leading me deeper into the archives, has always been twofold. Yes, we shepherd souls towards salvation, but we also stand as humanity's final guardian against things that should never have been born into this world. He stopped before a simple wooden desk, incongruous among the ancient grandeur. Upon it lay a leather journal, its pages yellowed with age and stained with something darker than ink. Beside it sat photographs, crime scene images that made my stomach turn, even after 20 years of studying humanity's darkest impulses. Father Giovanni Torretti, Alessandro said, his voice breaking slightly, our most experienced hunter. 43 years he served in this capacity, walking into darkness so that others might never know it exists. He gestured towards the photographs. Last month, the Roman authorities found what remained of him in the catacombs beneath San Clemente. What they couldn't understand was how a man could be torn apart from the inside out, or why his blood had been arranged in symbols that hurt to look at directly. I studied the images, my academic curiosity warring with revulsion. Giovanni's remains were scattered across ancient stone in patterns that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. The symbols carved into the catacombs' walls appeared to move, writhing like living things trapped in rock. The creatures are growing bolder, Alessandro continued. Reports flood in from across Europe daily. Munich reports 17 missing from a single apartment building, all taken from rooms 7 stories above street level. Prague's police refused to enter the old Jewish quarter after losing an entire patrol to something they describe only as children with too many teeth. Villages throughout the Carpathians have gone silent, their populations vanishing overnight, leaving behind only those cursed symbols and the echo of laughter that sounds almost, but not quite human. He paused, crossing himself with trembling fingers. Whatever ancient evil has awakened, it spreads like plague across the continent. And you, Father Benedetti, are now our only hope, the last hunter the church has trained. There are no others coming after you. The weight of his words settled over me, like a burial shroud. I had spent a decade studying demonology, exorcism, and the church's most guarded secrets, thinking myself prepared for anything. But standing in this hidden chamber surrounded by evidence of horrors beyond imagination, I realized how naive I had been. Before you read Giovanni's final testament, Alessandro warned, you must understand something crucial. These rules, he wrote, they are not guidelines or suggestions. They are not symbolic representations of spiritual truth. They are literal instructions for survival, written in his own blood as he lay dying, his final gift to whoever would follow in his footsteps. I reached for the journal with hands that surprised me by trembling. The leather was warm to the touch, as if recently held, and I could swear I felt a pulse within its pages, a heartbeat that wasn't my own. The first page bore Giovanni's familiar handwriting, though it grew increasingly erratic as it progressed, as if written under extreme duress. Above the rules he had inscribed a single line, "For whoever comes after me, may God forgive us both." Rule 1. Never hunt alone after sunset. The darkness gives them strength beyond measure, but they fear groups of 3 or more blessed souls. In 43 years, I have never seen one attack a trinity of believers who stand together in faith. Below this, Giovanni had sketched detailed diagrams showing hunting formations, positioning strategies, and emergency signals. His notes filled the margins. They move faster in moonlight. Shadows seem to bend around them. Alone, you are prey, but united in Christ's name, you become predator. Rule 2. Always carry consecrated salt in a leather pouch tied to your left wrist. Sprinkle it in doorways and windows of any building you enter. The salt must touch every threshold, every opening through which evil might pass. Giovanni's accompanying notes reveal decades of experimentation. Regular salt has no effect. Tried it in Vienna, nearly died. Must be blessed by bishop or higher. Leather pouch essential. Cloth rips too easily when they attack. Left wrist because right hand needs to be free for crucifix. Amount matters, too little and they break through. Too much wastes precious resources. Rule 3. If you hear Latin being spoken backwards, cover your ears immediately and recite the Lord's Prayer. Never attempt to understand the words or memorize their sequence. The backwards mass can corrupt even the most faithful soul. The sketches here showed men in various stages of corruption, their faces twisted with expressions of ecstatic agony. Giovanni's handwriting grew more frantic. Father Martinez tried to counter their black mass with proper Latin, found him 3 days later conducting his own backward service, tongue cut out to stop the blasphemy pouring from his lips. The corruption spreads through understanding. Ignorance is mercy. Rule 4. When tracking in forests, stay on established paths, marked by stone crosses. The creatures cannot cross onto ground that has been consecrated by centuries of pilgrimage. Trust the faith of those who walked before you. Giovanni had mapped dozens of pilgrim routes throughout Europe, noting which paths remained blessed and which had been corrupted. The Camino routes are strongest. 800 years of prayers soak deep into the earth. Avoid any path where crosses have been defaced or removed. They mark their territory by destroying our symbols. Rule 5. If you encounter a child calling for help in the wilderness, do not approach within 10 feet. Test them first by speaking Christ's name aloud. They can mimic innocence perfectly, but cannot bear to hear the Saviour's name spoken in faith. This rule was accompanied by the most disturbing sketches in the entire journal. Children's faces that were almost right, but subtly wrong. Eyes too wide, smiles too broad. Proportions that suggested something else wearing human features, like an ill-fitting mask. Giovanni's final note on this rule chilled me. They learn. Each encounter teaches them to be more convincing. The child I met in Munich looked more human than the one in Prague. God help whoever faces them next. The journal's final entry was dated 3 days before Giovanni's death. I fear I have taught them too much. They anticipate my strategies now, counter my prayers with blasphemies tailored specifically to shake my faith. They know my name, speak of my family, describe my childhood home in perfect detail. How do you fight an enemy that learns faster than you can adapt? God help whoever comes after me. They will face horrors I could never have imagined. Alessandro handed me a leather satchel containing bottles of holy water. blessed by 3 different popes, consecrated salt from the Holy Land, a silver crucifix that had been carried by crusaders, and a satellite phone programmed with emergency contacts throughout Europe. "Your first assignment," he said, producing a telegram marked with the highest priority seal, "came in this morning. The monastery of San Pietro Martyrs in the Italian Alps, built in 1147, continuously inhabited for over 8 centuries. 3 monks vanished during evening prayers 2 nights ago. The local carabinieri investigated and found evidence they refused to document officially." I studied the telegram, noting the location and sparse details. The monastery sat at nearly 8,000 feet elevation, accessible only by a single mountain road that wound through forests older than Christianity in that region. "Have there been other incidents nearby?" I asked. Alessandro nodded grimly. 11 villages within a 100-kilometer radius have reported disappearances over the past 6 weeks, always at night, always without witnesses, and always leaving behind the same carved symbols Giovanni documented throughout his career. He showed me enlarged photographs of the symbols, intricate patterns that seemed to writhe and shift when studied directly. "There's something else," Alessandro continued. "The monastery's bells have stopped ringing. For 800 years they've marked every hour of every day and night. The silence began exactly when the monks disappeared." As I prepared to leave, Alessandro placed his hand on my shoulder. His fingers felt cold even through the fabric of my cassock. "Thomas," he said, using my given name, for the first time in our 20-year acquaintance, "remember that Giovanni survived 4 decades by following these rules without exception. He faced horrors that would drive lesser men mad, yet he endured by trusting in the wisdom written in that journal. He only failed once." Alessandro's eyes met mine. "Do not let pride or compassion override your training. The things you will face have no souls to save, no humanity to appeal to. They exist only to corrupt and consume." The drive through the Italian Alps took me along roads that seemed to narrow with each kilometer, as if the mountains themselves sought to discourage visitors. Ancient forests pressed close to the asphalt, their shadows deep even in midday sun. By the time I reached the village of San Pietro, at the mountain's base, sunset was painting the peaks in shades of blood. The village church was older than the monastery above, its stones worn smooth by centuries of alpine weather. Inside, I found Father Francesco Alberti and Brother Antonio Rossi waiting for me, both men pale with exhaustion and fear. "Father Benedetti," Francesco greeted me with obvious relief. "We have been praying without cease since receiving your message. The situation above grows worse each day. Even the animals have fled the mountain. No birds sing, no insects buzz. The silence is," he struggled for words, "unnatural." Brother Antonio, a man in his 30s whose nervous energy reminded me of a caged animal, added, "The villagers speak of lights moving through the monastery windows at night, and sounds that carry down the mountain despite the distance. Sounds that make children cry, and old men cross themselves in fear." As we began the climb up the ancient mountain path, I explained the critical importance of maintaining our group formation. Giovanni's rules were not mere superstition, I told them, but wisdom purchased with blood and suffering across 4 decades of hunting humanity's darkest predators. "We stay together at all costs," I emphasized as we climbed. "If we become separated, do not attempt heroic rescues. Follow the marked path back to the village and radio for assistance. Better to lose 1 man than all 3. The monastery appeared before us as darkness fell, its Gothic towers reaching toward heaven like accusatory fingers. Built into the mountainside itself, it seemed to grow from the living rock, as if the mountain had birthed something holy that had since been corrupted. No lights flickered in any window, yet shadows moved behind the glass. Shapes that suggested human forms but moved with inhuman fluidity. "Madonna Santissima," Francesco whispered, crossing himself. "Something is very wrong here." I removed the leather pouch from my left wrist and began sprinkling consecrated salt across the main gate's threshold. The salt hissed as it touched the ancient stones, and I could have sworn I heard something retreat deeper into the shadows with a sound like silk being torn. The courtyard beyond was a study in violated sanctity. Garden plots that should have contained herbs for the monastery's kitchen were instead filled with twisted plants I didn't recognize, vegetation that seemed to writhe in the moonlight, their leaves rustling though no wind stirred. The central fountain ran red with liquid I didn't want to identify, and the stone saints adorning its rim had been defaced with those same symbols Giovanni had documented. "Stay close," I warned my companions as we approached the main chapel. "Do not separate for any reason. If you hear me give the signal to retreat, do not hesitate or look back." The chapel doors stood open, hanging on hinges that creaked with a sound like grinding bones. Inside we found a sanctuary, transformed into something from nightmares. The wooden pews had been torn apart, their pieces arranged in complex geometric patterns on the floor. Claw marks scored the walls, gouges so deep they went through stone carved by no earthly creature. The altar itself was the worst violation. The sacred table where Mass had been celebrated for 8 centuries was covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. They seemed to shift and writhe in our torchlight, forming new configurations that suggested meaning just beyond comprehension. The crucifix that should have dominated the sacred space lay shattered, its pieces scattered among the carved blasphemies. "Dear God," Antonio breathed, "what could have done this?" Before I could answer, we heard them, children's voices rising from the monastery's depths. Young souls, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, calling out in Italian with heartbreaking desperation, "Aiuto, aiutateci, please, someone help us." The voices were perfect in their innocence, filled with the kind of terror that reaches into your chest and squeezes your heart. They spoke of being lost, of being frightened, of needing rescue from something too terrible to name. Francesco immediately moved toward the stairs leading to the monastery's lower levels, but I caught his arm with enough force to stop him cold. "Wait," I commanded, Giovanni's 5th rule burning in my memory like a brand. "There are children down there, Father," Antonio pleaded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "We are sworn to protect the innocent. We cannot simply abandon them." The crying continued, growing more frantic and pitiful with each passing second. The voices begged in words that would have moved saints to action, describing hiding places and dark corners where they cowered from monsters beyond imagination. I raised my voice towards the basement stairs. "Jesus Christ is Lord and Saviour." The crying stopped as if someone had closed a door. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself, creating a void that pressed against our eardrums like deep water. Then, rising from the depths like smoke from hell's furnace, came a shrieking that shattered every remaining piece of stained glass in the chapel. The sound contained layers, not just one voice but dozens, maybe hundreds, all screaming in harmonies that no human throat could produce. Beneath the screaming was laughter, the kind of mirth that comes from watching innocence corrupted and faith destroyed. The chapel windows exploded inward as massive shapes crashed through them in showers of coloured glass and splintered lead. In the chaos of flying debris and billowing shadows, I caught glimpses of creatures that violated every natural law. They moved like spiders wearing human skin, their limbs bending in directions that shouldn't be possible, their faces almost recognizable as human, but stretched wrong, as if someone had tried to sculpt humanity from memory and failed horribly. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing both priests and pulling them toward the main entrance. We fled across the courtyard as more creatures poured from every opening in the monastery, like water from a broken dam. Their movement was wrong, in ways that made my eyes water to follow. Too fluid, too fast, defying gravity and geometry with casual indifference. But as we reached the main gate and crossed onto the mountain path beyond the monastery's walls, they stopped abruptly, as if they had struck an invisible barrier. Looking back, I could see the line of small stone crosses that marked the monastery's original consecrated boundary. The creatures pressed against this invisible wall, their forms writhing with frustration, claws scraping at empty air that might as well have been solid steel. What in God's name were those things? Francesco gasped as we made our way down the mountain path. I thought of Giovanni's journal, of the sketches and notes documenting 43 years of encounters with humanity's oldest nightmares. They are why the rules exist, I replied, and why Giovanni wrote them in his own blood. Back in the village, I filed my report through encrypted channels while Francesco and Antonio sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had witnessed. The monastery would need to be reconsecrated, I noted, assuming it could be reclaimed at all. Some corruptions ran too deep for cleansing. A week later, Cardinal Alessandro's next assignment took me to a region of Tuscany where rolling hills covered in vineyards hid darker secrets. The village of San Benedetto had stood for over 1,000 years, its residents living quiet lives among olive groves and medieval stone buildings. But for the past month, something had changed. Every night at exactly 3 a.m, the villagers reported hearing Mass being conducted in their abandoned church. The building had been derelict for decades, its roof partially collapsed, and its altar desecrated by time and weather. Yet, witnesses described beautiful Latin chanting that echoed across the valley with perfect acoustics, as if the ruined church had been restored to its former glory. Local police had investigated multiple times, finding nothing during daylight hours. But 3 residents who had ventured out to investigate the nighttime services had never returned home. Their families found only empty beds and doors standing open to the night. I arrived with Francesco and Antonio again, both men still shaken from our encounter at the monastery, but determined to continue their service. The village seemed normal during the day. Children played in narrow streets. Elderly men gathered in the piazza to argue about football. Women hung laundry from ancient balconies. But as evening approached, the residents retreated behind locked doors and shuttered windows, turning their backs on the ruined church that dominated the hilltop above their homes. The chanting began exactly 1 month ago, explained the village priest, Father Giuseppe, as we climbed toward the abandoned church. At first, people thought it was beautiful, a blessing perhaps, or the voices of angels drawn to our holy ground. But then the disappearances started. The church was a ruin from the outside, its walls cracked and roof open to the sky. Weeds grew through gaps in the floor, and birds had nested in the broken bell tower. Nothing about it suggested supernatural activity. At exactly 3 a.m, the chanting began. The sound was incredible. Dozens of voices raised in perfect Latin harmony, conducting what sounded like the most beautiful Mass ever celebrated. The words echoed from the ruined building with impossible clarity, as if the structure had been acoustically perfected by divine intervention. Brother Antonio smiled as we approached, his face lighting up with wonder. "It sounds like the heavenly host," he whispered, "like angels celebrating eternal glory." But something was wrong. As we drew closer, my academic knowledge of Latin allowed me to parse the words more carefully. They were beautiful, perfectly pronounced, flawlessly harmonized, and completely backwards. Not simply reversed, but inverted in a way that transformed sacred prayers into blasphemous mockeries. This was not Mass, but its opposite, a black Mass conducted in deliberate defiance of everything holy, designed to corrupt the sacred through mimicry and inversion. "Cover your ears," I shouted, remembering Giovanni's 3rd rule. Do not listen to the words. Do not try to understand them. I began reciting the Lord's Prayer at the top of my voice, drowning out the blasphemous chanting with words of genuine faith. Francesco and Antonio followed my example, though I could see confusion in their eyes as they struggled to understand why we were disrupting something that sounded so beautiful. The moment our prayers overpowered their chanting, the beautiful music transformed into screaming, a sound like metal being torn apart and souls being flayed. The air itself seemed to vibrate with malevolent rage, and the temperature dropped so quickly that our breath misted in the suddenly frigid air. The church's broken doors exploded outward in a shower of rotted wood and rusted hinges. From the darkness within emerged a procession of figures wearing priests' robes, but where their faces should have been were only voids filled with swirling darkness. They moved towards us with inhuman speed, their robes billowing though there was no wind, their void faces tracking our movement with predatory intelligence. I threw handfuls of consecrated salt, creating barriers between us and the advancing entities. Where the salt landed, the ground burst into holy fire that the creatures could not cross. They stopped at the burning lines, their void faces turning upward to release screams that shattered windows throughout the village below. We retreated carefully, maintaining our barriers of salt and prayer until we were well beyond the hilltop. Behind us, the screaming continued until the first light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, when it cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of wind through broken stone. "What were they?" Antonio asked as we made our way back to the village. "Servants of the backward mass," I replied, remembering Giovanni's warnings about corruption that spreads through understanding. The kind of beings that are summoned when sacred words are deliberately inverted to mock God. The third assignment came from Germany, where the Black Forest held secrets older than Christianity itself. Local authorities had reported missing hikers, experienced outdoorsmen who knew the region well, yet their campsite had been found destroyed and bloody, with strange footprints leading deeper into the woods. The forest was vast and ancient, filled with trees that had stood for centuries and paths that had been walked by pilgrims for over 1,000 years. Some routes led to monasteries and shrines, their ways marked by weathered stone crosses placed by faithful travellers across the generations. I brought 2 German priests who understood that their homeland concealed things that predated their faith. Father Wilhelm Hoffmann was an elderly man who had served rural parishes for 4 decades and understood that some evils were older than human memory. Father Klaus Weber was younger but had grown up in the forest region and knew its paths as well as any ranger. "The old pilgrimage routes are still blessed," Wilhelm explained as we entered the forest, along an ancient trail. "For 800 years, faithful souls have walked these paths to seek God in the wilderness. Their prayers have soaked into the very earth." Klaus pointed out the stone crosses that appeared every 100 meters, weathered by centuries of alpine weather but still clearly marked with Christian symbols. "My grandfather taught me never to leave the marked paths after dark. The forest is old," he said, "and old things remember when men were not welcome here." We followed the pilgrim route deeper into the forest as shadows lengthened around us. The trees grew larger and more ancient the further we travelled, their trunks so massive that 10 men linking arms could not encircle them. The canopy overhead was so thick that even midday sun barely penetrated to the forest floor. As night fell, we heard our first indication that we were not alone in the woods. Something large crashed through the trees parallel to our path, keeping pace with our movement but staying just beyond the reach of our torchlight. Occasionally we caught glimpses of pale forms moving between the massive trunks, but they never came closer than the edge of our illumination. "What follows us?" Klaus whispered. "Something that cannot cross onto holy ground," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Stay on the path, trust in the faith of those who walked before us." We found the hikers' remains in a clearing just off the main trail. Their bodies had been torn apart and scattered across an area marked by those same carved symbols we had encountered at the monastery. But unlike the previous sites, these carvings covered every tree in the clearing, spiraling up trunks and across branches in patterns that hurt to follow with human eyes. Father Wilhelm noticed movement in the darkness beyond our torches. "Mein Gott," he breathed, his voice filled with horror and pity. Dozens of pale figures watched us from the shadows between the massive trees. They had once been human, their basic shape was recognizable, but starvation and something worse had stretched their features into barely recognizable caricatures of humanity. Their eyes were black pits that reflected our torchlight like animal eyes, and their mouths hung open to reveal tongues that had grown impossibly long, writhing like serpents tasting the air. They reached toward us with skeletal fingers, straining against some invisible barrier that prevented them from stepping onto the blessed path. Their movements were pathetic and desperate, like starving children begging for food, but the sounds they made were not human, clicking and chittering noises that suggested insect communication rather than human speech. "Were they once pilgrims?" Klaus asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Perhaps," I replied, "or perhaps they are what happens to souls who stray from the path and encounter the forest's older inhabitants." We backed away, slowly, keeping to the ancient trail until the creatures disappeared into the forest depths. Behind us we could hear them crashing through the underbrush, following but unable to approach the consecrated ground we walked upon. The fourth assignment arrived with unprecedented urgency. Cardinal Alessandro's encrypted message was brief, but alarming. An entire village in Romania had gone silent. No radio contact, no travelers passing through, no response to official inquiries. Local authorities had sent a patrol to investigate, but the officers had returned speaking of impossible things they refused to describe in their official reports. I flew to Bucharest and drove through mountain roads that seemed designed to discourage visitors. The landscape grew increasingly desolate as I climbed into the Carpathian Mountains, passing through forests that looked diseased and villages that seemed to huddle fearfully in narrow valleys. The village of Brasov sat in a depression surrounded by peaks that blocked out much of the daylight, even at midday. As I approached along the single road that connected it to the outside world, I could see why the authorities were reluctant to investigate further. From a distance, the village appeared completely normal. Smoke rose from chimneys in neat columns, laundry hung on lines between medieval buildings, and gardens showed signs of recent tending. But as I drove through the main street, I realized there were no people anywhere, not a single human being visible, despite clear signs of recent habitation. Doors stood open, as if their occupants had simply walked away mid-conversation. Tables were set for meals that had never been eaten, with food still sitting on plates now covered by flies. Children's toys lay scattered in yards, and a dog wandered aimlessly through the empty streets, whimpering as if searching for its missing family. Following Giovanni's first rule, I waited until dawn to investigate properly. I had contacted the local Orthodox parish before arriving, and Father Dimitri Popescu and Father Pavel Ionescu had agreed to assist despite the theological differences between our denominations. Both men were experienced with rural mysteries and understood that some threats transcended religious boundaries. "The village has been like this for a week," Dimitri explained as we prepared to begin our systematic search. "Travelers on the mountain road report that it appears normal from above, but anyone who enters finds only emptiness and silence." Pavel, a younger priest with intelligent eyes and calloused hands that spoke of rural hardship, added, "My grandmother was born in this valley. She told stories of things that lived in the mountains before Christianity came to Romania, old things that resented the new faith and waited for chances to reclaim what they considered theirs." We began our search systematically, moving from house to house as the sun climbed higher in the narrow valley. I sprinkled consecrated salt at every threshold, creating blessed barriers wherever we went. the village showed signs of normal life, interrupted suddenly. Breakfast dishes still sat on tables, beds remained unmade, as if their occupants had simply vanished from sleep, and clocks had stopped at various times throughout the night, suggesting something had happened in stages rather than all at once. In the village school, we found children's artwork still hanging on the walls, innocent drawings of families and animals and houses beneath smiling suns, but scattered among them were newer pictures that made my blood freeze. Dark sketches that no child should have been able to create, depicting figures with too many limbs and faces that were almost human, but fundamentally wrong. What could make children draw such things? Pavel whispered, studying the disturbing artwork. Something that wanted them to understand what was coming, I replied, remembering Giovanni's notes about how the creatures learned and adapted. The village church was our final destination, a small stone building that had served the community for over 3 centuries. As we approached, I could see that its doors stood wide open, as if inviting visitors to enter and witness whatever lay within. Inside, we found them all. The entire village population sat in the wooden pews, exactly as they would during Sunday service. Men, women, children, even infants held in their mothers' arms. They were arranged in perfect family groups, dressed in their finest clothes as if for a special celebration. But their eyes had rolled back to show only white, and they sat with such perfect stillness that they might have been carved from stone. "Mother of God," Dmitri whispered in Romanian, crossing himself with trembling fingers. I counted quickly, nearly 200 people filling every pew, all sitting in complete silence with those terrible white eyes staring at nothing. The scene was profoundly disturbing, not just for its strangeness, but for its perverse orderliness. Whatever had done this had arranged its victims with care, as if staging a grotesque tableau. I motioned for silence and began backing toward the door, every instinct screaming that we needed to leave immediately. But as we turned to go, a small voice called out from behind the altar, "Vă rog, ajutați-mă, please help me." A little girl in a torn white dress ran toward us, sobbing with terror that seemed completely genuine. She was perhaps 7 years old, with large dark eyes and tangled brown hair. Her dress was stained with dirt and what looked like blood, and I could see bruises on her thin arms. She called out in rapid Romanian, her words tumbling over each other in desperate panic. "They made me watch. They made me see what they did to everyone. Please don't leave me alone with the monsters." Father Dmitri immediately moved toward the child, his pastoral instincts overriding caution. "Poor little one," he said in Romanian. "You're safe now. We'll take you away from this terrible place." But Giovanni's 5th rule burned in my memory like a brand. I caught Dimitri's arm before he could approach within 10 feet of the girl. "Wait," I commanded, though doubt gnawed at my certainty. The child looked completely human, beautiful in the way children are, with genuine tears streaming down her face and terror that appeared absolutely real. "Christ is Lord," I called out in English, then repeated it in Romanian, "Christos este Domnul." The little girl continued crying, reaching out with small hands that shook with fear. She spoke rapidly in Romanian, describing her hiding place in the church basement, the terrible sounds that had lasted for hours, her desperate attempts to avoid whatever had taken everyone else. Father Pavel began arguing with me in rapid Romanian, his voice rising with anger and confusion. This was clearly a terrified child, not some supernatural threat. How could I condemn an innocent soul to whatever fate had befallen the rest of the village? The Orthodox priests began moving toward the girl despite my protests, their compassion overwhelming their caution. The child continued to sob and plead, her distress appearing completely genuine. If this was deception, it was perfect in every detail, from the tears on her cheeks to the way she favored her left leg, as if injured. I studied her face carefully, searching for any sign of the wrongness Giovanni had documented in his sketches, but she was beautiful and innocent and utterly human in every visible way. Her white dress was torn and stained exactly as it should be after hiding from monsters. Her bruises looked real, her fear was convincing, and her pleas for help would have moved saints to action. Against every lesson Giovanni had tried to teach through his blood-stained journal, I took 3 careful steps closer. I needed to be absolutely certain before condemning what might be an innocent child to abandonment and death. She was close enough now that I could see individual tears on her cheeks, could smell the fear sweat that dampened her hair. The moment I crossed within 10 feet, her face split open. Not metaphorically, literally split, like a flower blooming in reverse or a fruit revealing its inner structure. What I had taken for a mouth expanded impossibly wide, revealing rows upon rows of needle-sharp teeth that spiraled down into a throat that seemed to descend forever. The sound she made was not quite a scream and not quite laughter, but something that contained the elements of both while being fundamentally neither. Her child's body remained unchanged from the neck down, making the transformation even more horrific. She was still wearing that torn white dress, still had those thin, bruised arms, but her head had become something from the deepest circles of hell. The entire congregation turned in perfect unison to face us, their white eyes suddenly blazing with terrible intelligence. 200 faces that had appeared peaceful in death now smiled with expressions of infinite malice and hunger. The girl thing launched itself at my chest with inhuman speed. Her claws, when had her fingers become claws, punched through my ribs like they were made of paper. Pain exploded through my torso as I felt bones crack and organs rupture. As my vision began to darken, I could hear the Orthodox priests fleeing in terror, their footsteps echoing through the church and out into the empty village beyond. More pale figures began emerging from every shadow, dozens of them, all wearing the faces of children, all reaching toward me with expressions of perfect innocence that concealed infinite appetite. With my remaining strength, I managed to activate the emergency beacon on my satellite phone, gasping out a final message to Cardinal Alessandro. Tell my replacement. Rule 5 exists for a reason. They can perfectly mimic innocence. They learn from every encounter. God forgive me for teaching them compassion. The girl thing's true face smiled at me with those spiraling rows of teeth, her voice returning to that sweet, childish tone that had first called for help. Thank you for coming closer, Father. We've been so very hungry, and you've taught us so much about how mercy can be a weakness. As consciousness faded, I heard her continue. The next hunter will be even more careful, won't he? But we'll be ready. We'll have learned new ways to seem innocent, new words to make the faithful doubt their rules. Each hunter teaches us more about human nature, about the compassion that makes you vulnerable. My last coherent thought was a prayer, not for my own salvation, but for whatever poor soul would come after me, armed with Giovanni's rules and now my own bitter lesson, that sometimes the greatest evil comes disguised as the thing we most wish to protect. 3 days later, Romanian authorities found the village completely abandoned, once again. No trace of the priests or the congregation remained. Only silence and emptiness that seemed to press against the psyche, like a physical weight. They also found my journal, its pages now stained with fresh blood, and a 6th rule written in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic as it progressed. Rule 6. Trust nothing that bleeds the same color as salvation. They learn from every encounter, adapting their deceptions to exploit the mercy that makes us human. The next hunter will face horrors I cannot imagine, armed with knowledge bought with our failures. God help him. The Vatican has since sealed the archives containing Giovanni's research and my final reports. They say they are training a new hunter, someone who will learn from the mistakes of those who came before. But in the deepest chambers beneath the Sistine Chapel, Cardinal Alessandro reads our testimonies and wonders if some hunts are meant to end in failure. After all, Every rule needs an exception to prove its necessity, and perhaps the darkness needs to claim its hunters occasionally, if only to remind the light that vigilance and faith must be absolute. The creatures we faced were patient beyond human understanding, willing to wait decades or centuries for the perfect moment to exploit the very virtues that define humanity. In the months following my death, reports began filtering back to the Vatican from across Europe. The creatures had indeed learned from our encounters. Witnesses described children who spoke perfect Latin, who could recite scripture with flawless accuracy, who bore stigmata that bled real blood, and wept tears that tested as human. They had observed our methods, studied our weaknesses, and adapted their deceptions accordingly. The new hunter, Father Michael Delacroix, lasted 6 weeks. He followed every rule Giovanni had written, heeded every warning I had added, approached every situation with clinical detachment that would have impressed the most hardened inquisitor, but the creatures had evolved beyond our documentation. They no longer relied solely on mimicking innocence. They had learned to corrupt faith itself. In a village outside Lyon, Father Delacroix encountered what appeared to be a fellow priest conducting an exorcism. The Latin was perfect, the ritual followed canonical procedure exactly, and the possessed victim exhibited all the classic signs of demonic influence. Only when Delacroix joined the ritual did he realize the truth. The priest was one of them, and the exorcism was actually an invocation designed to open doorways that should remain forever sealed. Delacroix's final transmission described entities that had learned to weaponize our own sacred rites against us. They spoke of creatures that could perfectly replicate the Mass, conduct confessions that left believers spiritually drained, and perform miracles that served only to corrupt those who witnessed them. The Vatican's response was swift and final. The Monster Hunter program was officially disbanded, its records sealed beneath layers of classification that would ensure they remained hidden for centuries. The threat was deemed too adaptive, too intelligent, too capable of learning from each encounter to risk further exposure. But Alessandro knew the truth that few others would accept. The creatures didn't need us to hunt them anymore. They had learned enough from Giovanni, from me, and from poor Father Delacroix to begin hunting us. The reports that cross Alessandro's desk now tell a different story. Priests across Europe describe parishioners who know too much about church doctrine, children who speak in tongues that sound like backwards Latin, and confessions that leave the confessor feeling spiritually violated rather than cleansed. In Prague, a choir of children appeared at midnight mass, singing hymns that brought half the congregation to tears of religious ecstasy. Only later did the surviving witnesses realize that the tears were tears of blood, and the hymns had been prayers to entities that predated Christianity by millennia. In Munich, a priest reported conducting last rites for a dying child who whispered secrets about heaven that no human soul could possibly know. The child recovered, miraculously, but the priest was found 3 days later in his cell, having carved those same spiraling symbols into his own flesh while trying to recreate the holy visions the child had described. In the Romanian village of Brasov, travelers report that it appears inhabited once again. Families can be seen going about their daily routines, children play in the streets, and the church bells ring at proper intervals. But those who stop to speak with the residents find conversations that circle back to the same topics: faith, innocence, the trust that should exist between shepherds and their flocks. The villagers ask probing questions about the visitors' beliefs, about their families back home, about their own capacity for mercy and compassion. They offer hospitality that seems genuine, invite travelers to stay for the evening service, promise blessings for those who participate in their community prayers. No traveler who accepts these invitations is ever seen again, but the village grows more populous each month, its residents always eager to welcome new souls to their congregation. Cardinal Alessandro sits in his office high above the hidden archives, reading reports that grow more disturbing with each passing week. The creatures Giovanni and I fought were merely scouts, he realizes now. Advance agents sent to study humanity's defenses and identify our weaknesses. The real invasion was never about brute force or supernatural terror. It was about corruption, about turning our own nature against us, about learning to exploit the very qualities that make us human until those qualities become weapons in enemy hands. Alessandro has begun drafting a new protocol, one that acknowledges an uncomfortable truth. Some evils cannot be fought directly. Some threats grow stronger when confronted, learning from each encounter until they surpass their teachers in cunning and capability. The new directive will be simple: avoid, contain, and pray that they lose interest before they complete whatever larger plan they're working toward. But Alessandro fears it may already be too late. Giovanni's journal contained references to ancient texts that spoke of cycles, periods when the barriers between realities grew thin, when things that should remain separate began to merge. The texts describe these events as occurring roughly every 600 years, each one leaving humanity fundamentally changed. The last such cycle occurred in 1347. History remembers it as the beginning of the Black Death, but the real scholars, those with access to the Vatican's deepest archives, know it as something else. The year the creatures first learned to wear human faces convincingly. Now, nearly 7 centuries later, the signs suggest another cycle is beginning. The creatures we fought were not invasive forces, but returning exiles, beings that had been planning their homecoming for longer than human memory could encompass. They had sent their scouts into our world to study us, to learn our languages and customs and beliefs. Giovanni, myself, and Father Delacroix had been their unwitting teachers, demonstrating through our very efforts to stop them exactly how human faith and compassion could be turned into vulnerabilities. Alessandro closes the final report on the disbanded Monster Hunter program and locks it in the deepest vault beneath the Vatican. Officially, the program never existed. Officially, there are no creatures learning to perfect their mimicry of human nature, but unofficially, Alessandro has begun sending discreet warnings to bishops across Europe. Watch for children who know too much, priests whose sermons leave congregations feeling drained rather than uplifted, and faithful parishioners who ask too many questions about doctrine and belief. The rules Giovanni wrote in his own blood were not lessons in hunting monsters, Alessandro realizes now. They were warnings about the beginning of humanity's final examination, a test designed by entities that had been studying us for centuries, waiting for the moment when they understood us well enough to replace us entirely. The children of Brasov still wait in their seemingly normal village, wearing faces of perfect innocence and practicing conversations designed to draw in the faithful and curious. They have learned patience from their encounters with Vatican hunters, learned to value long-term corruption over immediate satisfaction. Each new arrival teaches them more about human nature, about the hopes and fears that drive behavior, about the precise words and gestures that inspire trust and compassion. They are building a comprehensive understanding of humanity, one soul at a time. And when their education is complete, when they have learned to mimic not just innocence but wisdom, not just fear but faith, not just suffering but salvation itself, they will no longer need to hide in remote villages or abandoned monasteries. They will walk openly among us, indistinguishable from the humans they have studied so carefully, carrying within them the patient malevolence of entities that view our entire species as nothing more than a particularly complex puzzle to be solved. The Monster Hunter program failed not because its hunters lacked courage or faith, but because it was fighting the wrong war entirely. We thought we were the predators, tracking dangerous prey through shadowed places. We never realized we were the prey, being studied and catalogued, and gradually understood by hunters far more patient and intelligent than we could comprehend. The rules still exist, written in Giovanni's blood and sealed in archives that few will ever see. But they are no longer warnings for hunters. They are epitaphs for a species that taught its replacements too well, written by the last souls to understand what was really happening in those final moments before darkness learned to wear the face of light itself. The Vatican's bells still ring each hour, marking time for a world that grows smaller and stranger with each passing day. But Cardinal Alessandro no longer finds comfort in their sound. He knows now that some of those bells ring in churches where the congregations wear faces that are almost right, where children sing hymns that sound almost sacred, and where priests conduct services that seem almost holy. The difference between almost and exactly grows smaller every day. When it disappears entirely, humanity's long examination will finally be complete.